welcome back to Ground Zero Salem 3.0 with your host, Pat, as always. I'm just hanging out, enjoying my Sunday. It's going to be over soon. It's back to work tomorrow. I spent the majority of the day getting this Den of Iniquity kind of organized here. I showed you guys a little bit with the way things are arranged. I finally put all my CDs away. These are my massive wall of CDs, because you can't be a metal YouTuber without having a massive wall of CDs and silk flags. It's required. If you don't do it, you go to jail, and I don't want to go to jail. Anyways, so that's what I've been doing the past day or so, day and a half, is getting all this stuff up from the basement. I just want to continue on with talking about a bunch of the vinyl I've purchased in the past 6 months during this move, stuff I've been listening to, some very recent acquisitions, etc., etc. So let's kick it off with a hot new release on Blackwater Records out of Portland, Oregon. We have Alienator with Meat Locker. Great crossover. I feel like it breaks from the pack with a lot of modern crossover stuff, the stuff that comes from the hardcore scene, I guess. I think there's been a very, very strong influence of that power trip style of modern crossover with a bunch of the newer bands, namely Enforced and High Command, Dead Heat to an extent. They all have a certain type of production that's very clear and very robust and very loud, and a certain type of breakdown style. It's almost like modern crossover filtered through New York hardcore and Integrity and stuff like that. All great stuff that I like a great deal, but I feel like Alienator more reminds me of, if anything, past the 20th century, this band called Victim from Virginia Beach that was around in the early to mid 2000s that sounded directly in between the first two Agnostic Front records. There's more going on with Alienator, but I mean, you can't dispute that early AF is probably a pretty big influence. You've got two different members sporting AF shirts on the back there. You can hear a lot of Poison Idea there as far as the hardcore influences. I think just the local guys, probably putting a big influence on. If it was still the era where I was going by band shirts and bands to check out, this would be a great band for that, a great record for that. You got a Siege shirt, two AF shirts. I think that's a Wretched shirt. I'm trying to see here. Coro shirt. Yeah, these guys know their stuff. They're into good hardcore, it looks like. And it's great. The production style really captures that weird kind of reverb-soaked mid-'80s Combat Records kind of sound, especially the Crumbsuckers' Life of Dreams, kind of weird reverby, the way the drums sound. They're kind of slightly echoey and everything. Great throat-ripping, deep, hoarse vocals. He's not trying to do a Roger Murray impression or anything like that. Awesome solos, face-melting, ripping, hot solos. Awesome, awesome band. They're all bald dudes in tank tops with pointy guitars. I mean, you can't go wrong with that. You just can't. Switching directions violently, let's get to this Faust record. Faust So Far. As I mentioned last update, I've been exploring a lot more weird prog and psychedelic stuff. This is considered krautrock. I am a baby to this, although I've been aware of this stuff for 20 years. I had friends that were branching out of hardcore and getting into neo-folk and this kind of stuff and psychedelic music. So I've been familiar with Can and some other stuff like that. I've heard of Faust for a long time, but I've never really sat down and listened to him that much. And I guess this year just something broke where I just wanted to listen to stuff that was a little bit more experimental and a little bit more oddball and a little bit more pondering. And it's kind of funny because the hype sticker on this says, after the poor sales of their debut album, So Far presents the more commercial and accessible side of Faust without giving up their advanced and experimental personality. Yeah, it's still real weird. It's got a lot of soundscapey kind of elements to it. There's some like acoustic guitars and kind of folky, dreamy kind of stuff. The first song, Sunshine Girl, it's their big hit apparently. It's a rainy day, Sunshine Girl. It's almost like Marshall style drumming. There's a mention of how this band influenced like that first wave of industrial with like Neubauten and Throbbing Gristle and stuff, and I can totally hear that. You know, it's very weird on its face. It's got some electronic, like noisy, whooshing kind of elements in it. It gets kind of soundtracky at certain points. The vocals are kind of at a minimum. You know, they're singing on it, but not a lot. It's cool. I'm very new to stuff like this, really, and it's a great ride. So maybe if I'm feeling brave, I'll listen to their first one. But yeah, Faust so far, very minimalist there, very German. All right, Leprophiliac Geen. As I've been talking about over the past couple of years, I've gotten increasingly more picky when it comes to death metal. One thing that I'll always kind of have room for if it's done well is that sort of traditional style death metal that's like a little bit more basic and meat and potatoes and kind of punkish, like anything that touches tips, if you will, with the sound of like Impetigo or early Autopsy, Repulsion, any of the old masters that were a lot more kind of straightforward and basic. Like that's kind of how I want to hear my death metal. You can use the overused kind of descriptors like caveman or knuckle dragging or whatever. That's fine. But these guys, Leprophiliac, do that really well. You have like a full concept album around Ed Gein, you know, that's kind of well-worn territory with death metal, talking about serial killers, Macabre and whoever else, but they do it really, really well. It's great. I mean, the fact that in moments it actually reminds me of the almighty Impetigo is a super big compliment coming from me, because that's a hard band to replicate. Not that they're trying to do a worship thing or anything, but kind of invoking that spirit is difficult. Like those dragging kind of weird 1-2-1-2 kind of beats, you know, great, like kind of swampy growled vocals, but there's some enunciation in there. I mean, there's a few parts that get kind of almost kind of bolt throwery, but that's kind of a different thing than really what these guys do. But it's, yeah, really inhuman, raw-boned, classic style death metal. Then we had this Procrastinators record that I picked up along with my order of the Alienator LP from Blackwater. This is a compilation spanning 95 to 97. This is more of like traditional kind of sleazy, scrappy, garagey kind of punk stuff. Kind of snotty. There's like a cover of Bored to Death, which is an early G.G. Allin song. Very attitude-laden, equally influenced probably by that garage rock stuff, like the Gories maybe, or the Retards, and also kind of equally owing to maybe some like British punk kind of stuff. Really well done.
But it just got hard, I ran. Wanted to go a bit faster, ended up a disaster. Regression, connection. Where did all these political form? Did you think I could have been anyone? Regression.
It was in memory of their guitarist, Chris, who is no longer with us. Looks like there's a tribute on the back from Jerry A. from Poison Idea. So some nice words about him. But yeah, this really well-written punk stuff spanning, you know, a couple of years in the mid-90s when not as much stuff like this was going on. I feel like stuff like this blew up in Portland like 4 or 5 years later with the Riffs and the Exploding Hearts and bands like that. But yeah, good, straightforward punk stuff. Also, from the Pacific Northwest, we have Detestation. This is a compilation of singles and splits put out on Havoc Records. Band that I have many happy memories of listening to when I was getting into crust punk. This is relentless, fast, go for the throat kind of crust stuff. Kelly Halliburton was the bass player, played in a ton of bands from Seattle, including Defiance and many more. This band really did that kind of faster crust. I wouldn't say that it's exactly D-beat. I think this was in an era right before when people were trying to really replicate specific style of drumming and all that kind of stuff. It became very genre specific. The drumming is a little bit more imaginative and everything, but it is definitely heavily discharge influence and very, very fast, owing a lot to Scandinavian influences and stuff like that, and Japanese. Detestation, of course, Gizm record. And the last few songs, I'm not sure which record they're from, get a little bit more, you can hear what was to come in this genre soon, already happening with His Hero Is Gone, but the more kind of melodic, kind of epic stuff. There's a few tracks on the back end that are leaning in that direction. But yeah, great band, Detestation. I'm glad that stuff got reissued. But then I'm not sure what the story is with this band, Tuff Darts. I just bought this randomly because I thought they looked cool. It looks like this guy has gold fronts or something, but this is from like 82. So I don't know what the story is there. Kind of looks like Dave Vanian a little bit, maybe. This is like skinny tie, power pop, new wave kind of stuff. Pretty catchy, kind of sounds like a snottier younger brother to like the Cars or something like that, I guess. There's a pretty great song on here called Your Love is Like Nuclear Waste, which easily could just be like in the background in any trauma movie from the 80s, I feel like. But yeah, it's a fun listen. Don't know much about it, but it's cool. It's cheap. It's like $3. Then we got Iron Claw. It says right there, heavy rock. Heavy rock. All right. Scottish band. From what I've read on the liner notes, they were kind of just exploring like a lot of different stuff that was going on in hard rock at the time, the members of the band, and then they saw Black Sabbath live and had their minds blown and proceeded to do a bunch of songs that were probably an early example of like Sabbath worship almost, or their own version of it, to the point where, and I don't know how true any of this is, but it claims in the liner notes that they handed a demo to Sabbath, the members of the band, and didn't hear back for a while. And when they heard from them finally, it was from their lawyers saying that it was potentially like ripping them off to the point of it being litigious. I don't know. That's the early stuff on this. Later on, they get a little bit more like generally kind of 70s dad rock. There was one song where I was like, does this sounds like Steve Miller Band or something maybe? And I read the liner notes next to the song and said they were going for kind of a Stones thing. And I can see that. There's a little bit more like kind of bluesy, rhythm and blues kind of stuff happening later. But like the first LP is solid, like good proto heavy metal stuff. Not going to kick the other album out of bed there either. The other LP, that is. The other LP is really good, but they're just kind of exploring more influences, Wishbone Ash and Rolling Stones and some other stuff going on at the time. But yeah, raw recording, solid, hard, heavy rock. All right, Regurgitation. Complete recordings 1986 to 1987, including the Bathrooms Rule demo, some live tracks from Montreal, 1987, and Organic Backwash demo, 1986. Classic band that somehow missed my radar for a very long time, despite the fact that I love this early embryonic stage of death metal so much. I'm so happy I can still dig stuff up that I'm not familiar with. core members of this band went on to be in Old Lady Drivers, which is pretty interesting. This was put out by FOAD from Italy, who do an incredible job with reissues. I had a lot of their records about 7-8 years ago reissued by them, and it seemed to be mostly metal stuff, but they've reissued a ton of really, really nice versions of albums and compilations from Japanese and Italian hardcore bands. Very, very much worth paying for. Like, the import prices sometimes are a little bit much, but they always do an incredible job. They include a bonus CD usually with a lot of those like hardcore records. That's like live stuff and demo stuff. Can't say enough good things about FOAD. Anyway, Regurgitation, really impressive, like how ahead of the curve they were. There's something in the water in New Jersey, I guess. I don't know. The Bathrooms Rule demo is from '87, and I say it's every bit as ahead of the curve and proto grind, proto death as Repulsion and the Death demos. I mean, it's very, very scathing, like higher pitched kind of, but very, very growled, inhuman sounding vocals, verging on blast beats, vicious, vicious music. And the Organic Backwash demo is also really great. I'd say it's more of kind of like early death metal in the way that Possessed Seven Churches is, which I guess is a divisive topic. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. But it definitely comes from more that kind of Venom, Slayer, Possessed, satanic kind of stuff. It's a little bit slower and it's a little bit more like horns in the air, solo laden kind of proto black metal kind of stuff. Overall, completely great, and I'm glad that I got a hold of this and that it's in my life. Then we have Disarm Existence. This was another reissue on No Idols and Beach Impediment Records. Mastered by Chris Corey. Cool. Guy who plays guitar in Magic Circle, he's in Lifeless Dark. Reputation precedes him. Anyways, this is great. I was expecting more kind of crossover, or I don't know. There's a handful of American bands that kind of like tried their hand at sort of doing a conflict kind of thing, or there weren't many American bands that did anarcho-punk, but I thought this might be one of them, like Crucifix and that kind of thing. Just judging by the cover, you have a bomb being broken over the head of a Grim Reaper wearing a peace sign on a dookie chain, whatever. To me, this kind of sounds more like straightforward Californian hardcore, a little like more than anything else. It's great. It's like good US hardcore kind of stuff. It's great that the drummer is featured just doing a hand plant on the back, like not playing drums. I believe these guys were from the part of Virginia that had Mount Trashmore, which was like a very well-known skate park in the 80s where there was a big riot when Powell Peralta threw out too many stickers. I think that's that's where they're from. If I'm wrong, I'm going to delete all this. But yeah, there's a whole bit in the liner notes about how skateboarding played a role with the band and everything. And I think a lot of people forget that, the two subcultures and the two lifestyles and all that have gone completely separate, since like the late 80s, early 90s. And there's always been skateboarders into punk since then. But it seemed like during a time, because of Thrasher magazine and just the way things were culturally in the 80s, like the two were inseparable in the United States. And sometimes people forget that. But yeah, I mean, this is great ripping hardcore. It's very fast. I think there's a solo here and there, but it reminds me more of maybe, Final Conflict against, the pre-Suicidal Tendencies band. So yeah, like a little bit of Discharge influence and stuff like that, but I was expecting like something very, very anarcho just from the cover art, I guess. But yeah, very, very, very good. Tinge of metal. I was expecting it to be like almost like crossover, but certainly not disappointed. Like great, great record. Disarm Existence, Virginia Beach, right there. VB, that's what that means. Just figured that out. All right, then we've got the Fugs. I always wanted to check these guys out because two things. There's some spoken word joke skit at the end of a Meatmen CD where Tesco V it's like a fake interview and he's doing his thing and he's mentioning his influences and he mentions Crime, like proto-punk band from San Francisco, and the Fugs and a couple others. He's talking a million miles a minute because he's Tesco V. And there's that. And I remember reading an old interview with Jimi Hendrix in a guitar magazine as a kid. And he mentioned some of his favorite bands. And he mentioned the Fugs and that they were really weird. And they had songs about really strange stuff. And for whatever reason, that stuck with me. I have a later Fugs, two albums on one CD. I think one of them is called It Crawled Into My Hand, Honest. And I can't remember the other one. I think I sadly might have sold that or lost it because I just filed all my CDs and I would have like poured over it because this band's in the front of my brain right now. If not, I'll have to rebuy it. This is from '65. It was recorded in New York City. I was under the impression these guys were from San Francisco, but maybe I was just assuming that because they were a crazy freak out hippie band. Maybe they're from New York. I don't know. But at the time, it's right in the middle of the '60s. The whole psychedelic era hasn't quite kicked off yet, but there's definitely some wackiness going on here. There's a song on it called Boobs a Lot, which I can't stop giggling over because I am definitely 5 mentally and emotionally. There's a solid mix of different types of rock and roll. There's some weird kind of bluegrass country stuff going on. It's generally pretty interesting, pretty fun, free-spirited, weird 60s stuff. Then another one where I need to take off the shrink. But I'm one of those people, I got to keep the hype sticker. So I'll put it on a new poly bag because I'm one of those people. Anyways, it's Suicide's first rehearsal tapes. A little blurb by Henry Rollins. If you know Suicide, they were like minimalist, early punk pioneers, like big influence on some goth and industrial stuff, namely big influence on Sisters of Mercy. Early band to utilize a drum machine, just weird, like weird organs over drum machine and like kind of poetry style lyrics. And this is very stripped down, obviously. It's very, very minimalist, very atmospheric and weird, but recommended. It's a great record to throw on in the background. What was his name? Alan Vega. Super, super brilliant songwriter, artist. And yeah, there's a bunch of liner notes from Henry Rollins. It was, let's see, their early shows in NYC and abroad were conducted in an environment of almost constant mutual assault as performers and audience clashed from start to finish. That's how you know it's good. Yeah, I think this was just like recorded in like a theater or something like that. Just like live to tape. Very, very cool kind of atmospheric, drum machine driven, synthy, weird stuff. Then we've got a Boris collab, Boris and Uniform, Bright New Disease. Boris, again, one of these situations where I listened to him a bunch when they were blowing up in the mid 2000s and then just kind of forgot about him. Like all my friends were getting into the kind of weird sludgy stuff that was getting popular at the time. Pelican, Sun, Boris, handful of others, Harvey Milk, and I was kind of like, I don't know. If I listen to anything slow like that, I'd rather just listen to St. Vitus or Amebix. I don't know. There are a couple of Boris releases I liked at the time. I've been checking back in with them and really enjoying a lot of their stuff. This is cool because it's harkens back not only to the Boris material that I used to like, but also the era of metal industrial during the mid 90s, namely Ministry and KMFDM especially, and a lot more than that. There were tons of bands kind of doing speed metal with a drum machine kind of stuff. But saying that's what all that this is would be kind of insulting. I mean, no disrespect to KMFDM or Ministry, and neither of them were just speed metal with a drum machine either. But there were bands that were pretty much just trying to cash in on that. This does have a few songs. I'd say about half of the record is like faster metal with like some industrial trappings, but there's some creepier, slower songs that are kind of synthy, kind of bring to mind Skinny Puppy and stuff like that, or Chem Lab maybe. And alternating between the Boris vocalist and the other guy, sounds, when he's yelling, sounds like a hardcore vocalist. He kind of sounds like, I don't know, it's hard to place. He kind of sounds like my friend Chuck from the band Black Sheep Squadron a little bit on a couple of tracks. But yeah, overall it's a really cool record, really good mix of like heavy riffs and beats and synths and stuff like that. It's a good, enjoyable, engaging LP. Then we've got the latest from some local guys, Z28. This is AM Gold. This band's been around. I think they started not long before I moved away. They're from Salem, from the North Shore here, featuring Jeff Hayward. If you don't recognize that name, shame on you. He is the guitarist that played in Disrupt, Grief, and Mourn. And this is his project that's exploring way more of like kind of a 70s hard rock kind of thing. I think there's a certain epicness to it that still feels very, it's like the song lengths and the emotions displayed feel kind of doomy, but it definitely rocks out and has Hammond organ and stuff and has a very like boogie rock kind of vibe. I don't know if the term boogie doom has been coined yet. It probably shouldn't be, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it right now. This is the finest boogie doom I've ever heard. It's really, really well done. I like all their records. They have 2 previous albums that are both fantastic. I would recommend checking them out. You can kind of hear, a little bit of like what came before with the previous projects that he was involved in with those other records. Like they kind of scrape against sludge a little bit, scrape against punk like a little bit. They're both very like, 70s rock influenced as well, but this is very like fleshed out and realized and super catchy. It's really, really great. So if you like any like kind of 70s hard rock stuff, if you like doom and stoner stuff, Z28 is where it's at. Explore the whole catalog. It's great. It was put out by Residency Records, the record label. The record store is also here. It's great. Fine companion to that, it's a German band. This couples with that quite well. This is an album from 1972, Night Sun, Morning. I remember the first time I heard Satori by Flower Traveling Band and Kingdom Come by Sir Lord Baltimore, and I was like, this is so heavy and is so ahead of its time and so blistering. And I feel like if I were to pick a trilogy of like non-Sabbath, really, really heavy records from the 70s, this would probably be the third one. It's a new one to me. I mean, I forget where I heard about this. I just read about it somewhere and snapped it up. But man, it's a little bit overdriven. It's a little bit raw. Like it feels like it peaks out in moments. But like, yeah, like wailing vocals, wailing guitars, like blistering kind of bluesy riffing, super high energy. It feels very live. It's very, very good for that genre. Moving along on a similar trajectory, Splattered Records just reissued this Victor Griffin LP, which is as far as I understand, it's a compilation of his own recordings from, I think the 90s, I want to say. It was on a record label called Outlaw Recordings in 2004. Reed from Splattered just reissued this year, maybe late last year. If you're not familiar with Splattered, they do a lot of really, really cool reissues. A lot of like obscure new wave of British heavy metal stuff. Reed, the guy who runs the label, is in Overdose, which is great Motorhead worship. He was in Speedwolf, which was one of my favorite bands of that era, like late 2000s into early 2010s. And Victor Griffin, if you didn't know, was a key songwriter in Pentagram in the 80s and early 90s, I want to say. I think he was involved in some of the reunion stuff, but he was a lot of what made those albums like Be Forewarned really great during that era of Pentagram. And this is kind of like, there's stuff from kind of all over the map. There's some really good covers, like Ain't It Fun. They cover Iron Horse by Motorhead, and, which makes sense. And they do it incredibly well. He does it really well, I should say. There's also Vampire Love, which was a Pentagram song. And, you know, if you're familiar with the Pentagram stuff, I'm sure you'll love this. It's great heavy rock stuff, verging on doom. There's songs like Never Surrender, which are almost, that song's almost kind of like a punk song. You know, there's some really hooky choruses and stuff like that. Just great heavy rock. Again, heavy rock coming at you. And yeah, if you're a fan of those classic Pentagram, like 80s Pentagram records, you should definitely pick this up. Switching gears, some hardcore here. I was very, very excited that this got reissued. This is Ottawa, The Third Age. Awesome, like Michigan, pissed, metallic hardcore, kind of frenzied, grind influence, but not necessarily straight up grind. This record was originally the split with the band Jihad, who are also of a similar style. Just this kind of evil, like somewhere between grindcore, early black metal, hardcore punk, and like a touch of that kind of like ebullition screamo stuff, all mixed together.
The goat! The news around the mountain neck, in the form of a white collar, energy from boss to come through that action. People convinced that the nation's back. What? I am the dead! What a twist of the predator! What it is that never shall be! You're not gonna cry! Never forget who I got it! Past 2,000 years, Christianity spent its grip upon the human spirit. With crusades, the Inquisition, to the name of the life movement, creating a Holocaust, for which they show no credit!
Very, very good recording. As far as I'm aware, these guys went on to form Nama, which was another band that was of that style that was really, really great. This is one of those situations where they really cleaned up the recording. I believe they got a hold of the original tapes and actually remixed it and everything. It sounds massive. Sounds really, really good. Just frenzied, pissed, hardcore, political, uncompromising hardcore stuff. This was all an order from Rev that I made a little while ago. I had to pick this up because this is another example of stuff being like really cleaned up in the reissue and everything. No Escape, 90 to 93. Classic metallic Jersey hardcore stuff. Tim Singer, the vocalist, went on to be in Dead Guy and Kiss It Goodbye. I believe looks like they shared members with Turning Point, which I wasn't aware of. They did a split with Turning Point as well. What to say about this? Well, I remember getting into hardcore in the 90s and being confused as to why it was slow and metallic, because everything I'd gotten into up at that point was stuff that other skateboarders had taped for me. It was stuff that I found at the mall, you know, namely like Live at CBGB's by Agnostic Front, The Exploited, and Dead Kennedys. I had no idea that hardcore, and I mean, my first show was right after New Year's, 92. I had no idea why all this stuff sounded like, it was good, I liked it, but it was so stompy and metallic. There seemed to be a lot of like crossover in sound with bands that were popular on MTV, like Helmet or even Pantera sometimes. And I always kind of wondered what the genesis of that was, and I don't think it was one particular band, but I would say that No Escape, Burn from New York, Inside Out from California, who would later go on to feature Zach De La Roca from Rage Against the Machine. Those were a few of the patient zeros of like hardcore slowing down, especially the more clean cut, like Youth Crew kind of stuff, like sort of transitioning into this. And this is awesome, just angry. It's nonstop, well-paced, just relentless, mid-paced, crunchy hardcore stuff. I also, and you know, who cares about fashion? It's not the important part of it, but I do like that these guys easily could have been a Seattle grunge band. I'm trying to find a good example of this here. They're all wearing flannels and flannels and combat boots, and they all, like 3 or 4 of them have long hair. Like, but this is preceding a lot of that stuff blowing up. I mean, 1990, you know, Smells Like Teen Spirit didn't happen until late 91, I want to say, something like that. I don't know. Not anything important, like, you know, but I thought it was kind of interesting that these guys all kind of like looked like grunge dudes before that was really a thing. At any rate, awesome blistering stuff, like really heavy hardcore. And then from the same state, let's remove the shrink on this one. Doesn't have a hype sticker. This is Encounter, which is a band that did they play my first show? It was either Encounter or Point of View. That was another Jersey band. I saw Encounter numerous times. This shrink is gonna fucking beat it. Fuck. Okay. There you go. This just came out too. Restore, Reform, Reclaim. Huge. You know it's the 90s because the fat X's, big fat X's on the back of the hands there. Awesome band. One of those bands that were around for a year or two and then other stuff blew up, like Bloodlet got really big and Damnation AD, and I kind of stopped hearing. I'm sure these guys broke up, but these guys like Edgewise from Pennsylvania. But just great early 90s, sort of metal tinged. The earliest recordings on this are a little bit more towards like the faster end of the spectrum. But very cool riffs, like certainly borrowed a lot from like kind of thrash metal here and there, but dumbed down a little bit, kind of repurposed into being emotionally leaning, sort of politically aware hardcore stuff.
My voice unheard, my position unnoticed. Said it in the beginning, pathetic at the end, though I wasn't aware of life that you took me. You thought I spoke to see my breath for the air, and that's what you could say that you have. All that you declare that you've won. My distrust, my anger. Now, my rage!
Straight edge stuff. Great sound of the era. And then last in the pile, this is something I'd had on CD for forever, and I decided, you know, it's a classic to me. I think, and this is, you know, not to name drop or anything, but I think it was Joel Grind. He lived in Florida around the same time I did, and I met him a few times. He was just hanging out at a record store down in the Tampa area, Sound Idea Records, which was it's no longer, but it was like a mainstay for years for ordering records out of the back of MRR. They had an incredible stock. Bob Surin, the owner, was a really knowledgeable guy who put out some pretty cool stuff on a label called Burrito. It was a great place to find like obscure stuff. Anyways, when Joel lived there, I remember him mentioning to somebody else or me, like, oh yeah, did you see that Sound Idea has a CD by this band Fingernails? And I bought the CD. The CD has like more songs, bonus tracks and stuff. But my introduction to like that kind of Italian speed metal kind of stuff, Motorhead worship, kind of led me down on a path of like what more bands were like doing the specific style of Motorhead, Venom, Tank, kind of, you know, speed metal, heavy metal, punk, heavy metal kind of stuff. And this just gets it, man. It kills. Heavy Metal Forces. You can't go wrong with the first track on side B, Crazy for Blowjobs. You know, it's got that sort of sleaze to it, of course. But yeah, hot, just nonstop, fast, relentless, Motorhead fueled heavy metal madness. And it's fantastic. This was reissued on NWN. And nothing really interesting. But there's the center label. I always forget to do that. I don't even care anymore. All right, so that's it. This weird mic.
Can we get a shot of the furry thing up there? It's very nice. This is a furry thing.
Look at this.
Look at that.
Don't you wish you had one just like it?
This is the world's first pure mink microphone.
It reminds me of my cat's first interview I've ever done talking into a hamster.
Is down here. Hopefully that wasn't distracting. I feel like putting shaving cream on it, you know? It's just a weird vibe. I want my Blue Yeti back. Like, I think it works better to just have a mic in front of me. I feel weird. Maybe I should do this. I'm a video essayist. In today's modern landscape of techno-feudalism, okay, anyways, On that note, I'm going to re-sleeve these and go to bed. I hope everybody has a good week. If you have any thoughts, concerns, comments, a lot of this stuff, especially that krautrock stuff, I don't even know what I'm talking about. So any corrections or suggestions, I always welcome that. I hope everybody has a good week and a good life. Bye.